a second. Hey guys, well, I am excited to be talking today with Rafia Zakaria. She is the author of a new book called Against White Feminism. I just had the chance and pleasure to read this book, and I hope you guys will listen to this conversation because I think it's incredibly important for particularly white women who consider themselves feminists to grapple with what she's talking about in the book. So, Rafia, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciated the book so much. I really loved that it was, it was really a book that was making some good criticisms of white feminism, but you did such a great job of talking both about the concepts and then giving really concrete examples. So I wanted to just jump right in with a question of what is the problem with colorblind feminism. So I think a lot of women who are feminists think, this is a colorblind movement. This is for women. So, we're not going to focus on race because it's for everybody. What's the problem with coming to feminism from that kind of lens?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the problem with it is quite simple, is that the feminist movement as it's been constructed right now is a movement that relies on the idea of solidarity equaling the erasure of race. Mm-hmm. So that, as you said, anytime you bring up the topic of race, that's considered sowing dissension or being divisive. And what I wanted to show in this book is that the consequence of that almost deliberately cultivated silence on race has meant that race has become the feminist movement's biggest handicap. Mm-hmm. And to the point where, the effort to avoid discussions of race have become absurd, mm-hmm. And so that was the central issue that worried me. I think that there is definitely a latent worry among white women and white feminists that if you start talking about race or the intersection of race and gender intersectionality, they're going to essentially be forced out of feminism. Mm-hmm. That's what I've heard. But, mm-hmm. My book is not a call to do that, even mm-hmm. to the extent that, by white feminist, the very first page of the book explains how by white feminist, I don't mean someone who's white and a feminist. Mm-hmm. I mean very particularly white women who are uninterested or unwilling to look at the role that racial privilege has played in the feminist movement and ensuring their dominance in mm-hmm. the feminist movement or in general. Mm-hmm. So it's a very particular definition of white feminism that I'm mm-hmm. deploying here. It's not a racially descriptive term. Mm-hmm. I talk about how there can be brown and black white feminists because, mm-hmm. The system that we have doesn't just, valorize and center white women. It also rewards, minority or women of color who kind of pander to that system yes. and don't challenge it. So I think that's very important to remember.
You talked about something that I thought that really was convicting for me, this difference between rebellion and versus resistance and how white feminism recognizes rebellion over resistance. Talk to me about or resilience. Talk to me about that a little bit.
Yeah. The point, there are certain adjectives, right, that feminism as white and Western feminism has embraced. And they've embraced them to the point that those are the qualities that are considered feminist, right? So mm-hmm. rebellion would be number one, I would mm-hmm. say. Mm-hmm. And the problem that I saw with that is that if you're only looking for rebellion all around the world, you're not going to find necessarily, Black, brown, Muslim, whatever, feminists that fit your narrow definition of what rebellion is. And the reason why I was saying that is pointing that is because I want readers and feminists to become sensitive to how certain paradigms are used to evaluate women all around the world. But since the paradigms have come out of, white racial privilege, the problem has been that that they only sort of reward and elevate white women.
Yeah.
So, for
Yes.
instance, like if you're never looking for resilience, and this comes like from a very kind of poignant place in my heart, because I remember talking about this to my mother, and she was someone who had resisted so many things. She, we obviously lived in Karachi in Pakistan. She'd never really worked outside the home, but she really fought tradition, and resisted sort of giving up her identity and who she was to sort of this to the patriarchal system. And she learned how to drive and would drive me to like a very very crowded and aggressive highway to take me to school where I got my education. And she would say, oh, well, that's what they consider feminism. So I've not done any of those things, I haven't climbed a corporate ladder or fought against men. And that's the story of millions and millions of women around the world.
Yes.
Who just feel that that they will not be considered valuable within the feminist movement.
Yeah.
Their perspectives and their choices. And so that's what this was. I wanted to show that we need a more diverse lexicon, even in terms of the qualities that we call feminist qualities.
Yeah. Another quote from the book that I really appreciated was, you talked about the division of women who have a voice versus the women who have experience. Or you also talked about the women who write about feminism versus the women who live without, the benefits of feminism, and how the voices that tend to rise to the top are the people who are sitting in privilege, not necessarily experiencing the actual oppression of, a lack of feminism.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I both worked in a shelter and had lived in a shelter. But the part that bothered me was that I could never really talk about that in a professional setting unless I was willing to inhabit this role that brown and Black or Asian women of color are put in, where they tell the stories of their trauma. So, it's almost like there's this ridiculous division of labor where I'm supposed to tell my story of trauma, but it's white women who are going to make the policies and, be considered experts in feminism. And, you see that, I mean, most recently it was visible in what happened in Texas, right? Because there's an abortion ban in place, but because the ban itself doesn't really have any kind of racial component, even though, brown and Black women are definitely going to be more affected by it than white women, the women you saw on TV or writing about it were all white women who are very removed from the conditions that, from like they're not Texan, they're not, I mean, basically they don't have any direct experience. And that points out sort of how we create this hierarchy. And it often is intimidating almost to women who have actually experienced trauma, because because it's this kind of gatekeeping mechanism that exists within sort of the upper echelon of white feminism,
Mm-hmm.
where nobody even considers. I wanted people to start questioning whether women who have never really experienced anything directly um, are just, uncritically accepted as experts on feminism.
Mm-hmm.
I want to dislodge that
Mm-hmm.
paradigm so much so that, and this is true, I mean, for white women too. There are plenty of white women in the shelter that I was at,
Mm-hmm.
and they, they would feel the same way. They would say, what do I have to add?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like my life, it's so sad. When you encounter someone who has gone through indescribable trauma, has made their way out, is
Mm-hmm.
being a single mom to 4 kids, and then they say, what do I have to add within feminist discussions? It's
Right.
because, there's like a sort of elite cabal that
Yeah.
is always the loudest. And,
Yeah.
and so these experiences of other women are left essentially by the wayside.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And I loved how you talked about, one of the problems of white feminism being that we're using the same structures of white privilege in terms of who we reward, what standards we put in place to who we listen to, whether that be access, education, wealth. There's these sort of markers that this entire system has put in place to say this is who we value, which makes which makes the voices the most privileged in the room as opposed to the most experienced.
Precisely. And the issue is that this does not, I mean, the paradigm that we have within the United States, where, for instance, in the 80s, Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin were, anti-porn feminists, and they lobbied hard for the Violence Against Women Act, whose entire purpose was to quote unquote protect women. Now, when this, when this act was about to pass, Black and Latina women complained, and they said, this is going to lead to our men being arrested, and this is going to, contribute to mass incarceration. Nobody listened to them at all. And that is exactly what happened. The the black men were arrested at 5 times greater rate than white men, and a year or two after the law was passed, Black women were actually experiencing higher rates of violence than before the passage of the act. So that's another example, because you look at the mechanism there, right? You've got these white women at the top who really want to pass this law, and they want the state to protect them, essentially, right? But of course, that experience of that by Black and brown women, even in the United States, is to say, okay, well, we're not particularly interested in protecting you, and we're not going to serve as a check on state power. Now, the same paradigm is repeated abroad, where you have white feminists who are installed in, large global NGOs, the UN, all of these large transnational bodies that decide how hundreds of millions of development dollars will be spent. The example I give in the book is of clean stoves for India.
Yeah.
It's a multi, I mean, it's many hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on this program that was meant to deliver rural women in India from their, smoky wooden stoves. So what they did is they went around, gave these women these stoves, and and then basically were like, okay, this clean stove means that these women will no longer have to um, they're no longer going to have to go to collect wood. There's going to be less smoke. There's going to be less environmental impact from the fact that they won't be using firewood. Um, and then because they'll have all this free time that's opened up, they can go and get a job outside the home and 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 then become wage earners and be more have more decision making power within their within the family unit. And the insanity of all this is that nobody seems to have asked rural Indian women
Right.
whether
If this is
they
going to
wanted
improve
the
their
stoves
life.
or not,
Yeah.
right? And so when they were given the stoves, they took them, but they kept cooking on their wooden stove,
Right.
that or their clay stove, that they wood burning stove,
Mm-hmm.
that they could make themselves and fix themselves
Right.
and
That they were
cook
used to using.
precisely.
Yeah.
Um, and and when they were asked about this, finally, they said, "Look, I like going out. Um, I like going out to collect wood with the women of the village.
Mm-hmm.
It's my social time.
Mm-hmm.
We get to exchange news. We get to hang out with each other. I don't want to give that up."
Yeah.
And, and it was found that, the environmental impact of the little bits of firewood that they were collecting were negligible compared to like the logging that was going on in those
Right.
forests. So this idea that somehow it was their fault that there was deforestation going on is also ridiculous. But ultimately, it's like we don't want to work outside the home,
Yeah.
and the reason we don't want to work outside the home is that the only jobs that are available to us over here are, things like working in construction sites, breaking rocks.
Yeah.
And we don't want to do that.
Right.
We definitely don't want to do that. And so I think that example really shows so many assumptions that are operative there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Women in the West, white women, especially, are very much aligned with this kind of individualistic, ambitious, and I'll lean in as hard as I can
Yeah.
to get higher and higher. That's very much like their attitude. So obviously they assume that, okay, rural women in India want the same things that we do.
Right.
So they want, and that they value the same things.
Yeah.
So it says so much, right? Because you have these women who, like the women who make the programs, who just cannot conceptualize why someone would choose to be a little poorer, but more enriched in terms of their
Right.
sisterhood.
Right.
Then, yeah, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we are at today with
Mm-hmm.
feminism, is
Yeah.
that because it has cultivated this individualistic, careerist kind of idea of success, white women especially are denied an experience of sisterhood, of
Yeah.
meaningful.
Yes. I completely agree. And I loved how you talked about this sort of white savior complex and how, white feminism tends to oversimplify the problems of black and brown women and then try to find these really like oversimplified solutions that aren't taking into account differing values.
Yeah, precisely. No one in the United States would ever say, okay, well, Muncie, Indiana is like a town that's experiencing a downturn, but you know what? We're just gonna provide chickens to all the women in Muncie so that they can, then the chicken will lay an egg, and then they can sell the eggs, and there'll be more eggs, and before you know it, they'll have like a poultry business. No one's
Yeah.
ever going to say that,
Right.
right? And the reason they won't say that is because everyone understands that there are complex problems there. But when it comes to women, I mean, this chicken example that I'm giving is a real
Yeah.
example, right?
Yes.
Bill Gates, the
Yeah.
Gates Foundation, came up with this idea that if you give chickens to women in Africa, then suddenly they'll have this poultry business, and that'll be, the
Yeah.
end of poverty and all
Problem
these.
solved.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's ludicrous, right?
Yeah.
And the program didn't work, and it was abandoned. Um, but the larger issue is that we absolutely cannot have this kind of reductionist framework
Yeah.
to apply to each other. You know, um,
Yeah.
like I mean, for instance, a feminist that I spoke to in Pakistan, women that lived in a small city, but and they said, we're all educated. The education is not a problem. We just don't have any jobs.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, one more point that I would like to make is also that, it's a myth that the white Western world or the white feminist industrial complex is selfless and benevolent.
Yeah.
That is a myth that is so deliberately cultivated, right?
Yeah.
Is that they were just giving out these stoves out of the goodness of their heart,
Right.
or and that's repeated in many, many contexts. And
Yeah.
the result is that nobody ever looks at the cost of those quote unquote good intentions. And
Right.
there are real costs, not
Absolutely.
only of money wasted, but also like a failure to recognize that when aid giving agencies, et cetera, give something, they foment and sort of strengthen the
Yeah.
white industrial feminist complex,
Yes.
right? Because then it's like the white woman, she's so noble and
Yeah.
benevolent, and then she's going to go and help this poor woman in India who doesn't even seem to know how to take care of her own children.
And then it just perpetuates.
The hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yep. It
Absolutely.
just keeps perpetuating the hierarchy. So it's not that aid is bad.
Right.
I'm not saying that like helping people in other countries is
Right.
bad.
It's
I'm
the
just
helping without input, without consideration, without a cultural lens.
right, or sort of not taking note of the power difference.
Yeah.
So,
Yes. Yes.
recently the US withdrew from Afghanistan, and there first, of course, it was just white women talking, because until like brown women raised like an uproar that,
Yeah.
oh, like, can you please talk to actual
Yes.
Afghan women about
Yes.
this as opposed to you? So eventually that happened. But even in that conversation, the women that were brought on are women who've, for instance, I was on Democracy Now! With this one Afghan woman, and she took USAID money for her NGO for decades,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not a bad thing, but it
Right.
also means that when she's talking about the United States and imperialism, she has signed on to that
Right.
project of
Right.
neo-imperial. Here's
Right.
the feminism.
Right.
I brought it to you from
Right.
New Jersey, and
Yeah.
here you apply it in Kandahar.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I appreciated your book so much. We're just touching the surface of what your book talks about. I hope everyone will go out and buy it. Where can people find you online?
I'm Rafia Zakaria Feminist on Instagram, and just Rafia Zakaria on Twitter.
Great.
And the book is available anywhere you can buy a book.
And I'll have all of that linked up as well. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.